Philadelphia International Airport never truly sleeps. It only slows down. In the early morning hours, Terminal B exists in that particular hollow suspension between the last departing red-eye and the first wave of business travelers who will arrive smelling of hotel soap and carrying coffee they purchased elsewhere because the airport shops are not open yet. The fluorescent lights run at full brightness, indifferent to the fact that the people beneath them are exhausted or grieving or returning from somewhere they cannot talk about. The cleaning crews move in unhurried loops. The gate agents scroll their phones behind their counters. The security checkpoint is quiet, manned but not pressed. The conveyor belt is still. The body scanners idle. This is when Officer Vance Harlan liked it best. Not because he preferred quiet. He was not a man built for quiet, not genuinely, but because the empty terminal in those hours was his in a way that the busy daytime terminal could never quite be. During the day there were supervisors, visible travelers in clusters, the ambient friction of too many people to manage cleanly. In the early hours the hierarchy simplified. There were travelers and there were officers, and in Terminal B, in the particular stretch of concourse between those gates, Vance Harlan was the officer. The distinction mattered to him in ways he had never examined carefully enough to articulate. He sat in his cruiser near the security checkpoint, the engine running for the heat, his coffee on the dash where it had been cooling. Many years on the Philadelphia Airport Police, many years of this terminal, this checkpoint, these gates. His supervisors called him experienced. His performance reviews used words like proactive and detail-oriented, and demonstrates initiative in low-traffic patrol environments. Commendations on his record were framed in his den at home. His wife had put them up. He had let her because they said something he wanted said. What they did not say, what no performance review had ever named directly, was the pattern. It existed clearly enough if you looked at the data, and certain people within the Philadelphia Airport Authority had looked at the data and had filed the data and had allowed the data to be covered by the signature of Deputy Chief Clayton Holt on multiple occasions. Clayton Holt had gone to the same high school in Bucks County. They golfed together on the third Sunday of every month when the weather permitted. These facts appeared nowhere in any official document, which was precisely the point. The pattern was this. Vance Harlan had a habit of finding reasons to stop black men traveling alone through Terminal B, particularly those who presented a certain combination of qualities that Harlan's mind, operating well below the threshold of conscious analysis, flagged as incongruent. A man whose clothing suggested means that Harlan's gut told him did not fit. A man who was too relaxed in a space where Harlan believed certain men should look more uncertain. A man who carried himself without the particular kind of visible deference that Harlan had come over many years to expect and depend on. He was not, in his own accounting of himself, a prejudiced man. He was experienced. He had instincts. He had been doing this long enough to know what did not add up. He took a sip of the cold coffee and made a face. His radio crackled with a routine call from a colleague at the far end of the terminal about an unattended bag that turned out to be a laptop case whose owner was in the restroom. Harlan let someone else handle it. He was watching something else now. Chief Petty Officer Darius Delaney moved through Terminal B the way he moved through most environments, with the unhurried, deliberate economy of a man who understood that energy spent on performance was energy unavailable for actual purpose. He wore his Navy utility uniform, the digital camouflage pattern crisp, despite the length of the journey. The bronze Trident warfare pin sat precisely above his left breast pocket, subdued rank insignia on his collar, the specific weight of a man who had not had more than a few consecutive hours of sleep in recent days. He carried a single green duffel worn at the handles from use rather than neglect. He had been in the Horn of Africa on classified duty. The nature of what he had done there remained locked at a level that meant he had not discussed it with anyone outside the team, and would not. He had made his peace with that reality years ago, the way men in his position made peace with most things, by accepting it as the cost of the work and refusing to spend energy resenting the price. He found an empty seat at one of the gates, set his duffel between his feet where he could feel it against his ankles, leaned his head back against the wall, and closed his eyes. He thought about Layla. She was his young daughter, and she had her mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness. The last time he had called home from a satellite phone in a location he could not name, she had told him with great seriousness that she had decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, or possibly a veterinarian, or possibly both, and that she had looked it up and you could actually do both if you were organized about it. He had told her he believed her completely. He had meant it. She was the most organized person he had ever met, and he had spent over a decade operating alongside some of the most disciplined human beings on Earth. Over a decade in the teams, multiple silver stars, one commendation he would never be able to discuss in any public forum for the remainder of his life. He was not a man who led with his accomplishments, not because he was modest in the self-conscious way, but because in the environment where he operated, credentials were not currency. Performance was. The men who knew him needed no credentials. The men who did not know him did not need them either, because the interaction was unlikely to last long enough for it to matter. He had not anticipated this interaction. From across the terminal, Vance Harlan looked at the man at the gate and felt the familiar tightening in his jaw. The uniform registered. He processed the camouflage pattern, the insignia. But something else registered before any of that completed its circuit. Something that operated faster than conscious analysis and dressed itself up in the language of instinct and experience to avoid being recognized for what it actually was. The man was too relaxed. The duffel was too worn, which meant either it was old or it had been used hard. And either way, that raised questions. The uniform looked right, but Harlan had seen people buy uniforms online. He had seen fake IDs that were better than he would have expected. He had seen stolen valor cases, not many, but enough to establish the concept as a legitimate lens through which to view any situation he chose to view it through. He set down the coffee. He got out of the cruiser. He walked toward the gate with the slow, proprietary stride of a man who had already written the ending of a story he had not bothered to read yet. Harlan stopped a short distance from the bench. He rocked slightly on his heels, thumbs hooked into his belt, and looked down at the man with the particular posture of an officer who understood that physical positioning was its own form of authority. He let the silence stretch. This was a technique he had refined over many years. The deliberate pause before the first word, the invitation for the other person to fill the quiet with something nervous and revealing. Most people filled it. The nervous ones filled it immediately. Darius Delaney opened his eyes and looked up at him and said nothing. He did not look startled. He did not look guilty. He did not look apologetic. He looked at Harlan with the calm, assessing directness of a man who had spent over a decade reading rooms far more complex than this one, and whose baseline expression for any situation, until proven otherwise, was patient professional attention. Harlan did not like it. "Hey," he said. "This your bag?" "It is," Darius said. "You military?" The question, given the uniform, was objectively absurd. Darius registered that it was absurd without allowing any awareness of the absurdity to show on his face. "Navy," he said. "Chief Petty Officer Darius Delaney." Something moved behind Harlan's eyes at the name. Not recognition, not reassessment. It was closer to what happened when a man who had made a decision encountered information that required him to either revise the decision or reframe the information. Harlan reframed. "Got some ID on you?" Darius reached slowly and deliberately into his breast pocket. The deliberateness was intentional. He was aware, with the precise situational awareness of a man trained to track multiple variables simultaneously, that every gesture he made was being cataloged by someone looking for a reason. He produced his common access card and held it out between two fingers. Harlan took it. He looked at it for longer than was necessary, turning it over, tilting it under the fluorescent light, performing the examination with the thoroughness of someone who had already reached a conclusion and was now constructing the justification around it. Then he looked back at Darius, and his expression had shifted from performative authority into something flatter and more certain. "Where'd you get this?" The question fell into the quiet terminal like something dropped into still water. Darius held the man's gaze with an expression that contained no anger, no fear, and no particular surprise. "It was issued to me," he said, "by the United States Navy." "These can be faked," Harlan said. His voice had acquired a new texture, the tone of a man who had already decided and was building the paperwork around his conclusion. "I've seen it before. Guys buy the uniform online, get a decent fake ID printed, walk around collecting thank yous and free meals. It's called stolen valor. Federal offense." The words hung in the air. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the concourse, a gate agent's radio murmured a flight announcement for a departure that would not concern either of them. A few early travelers had drifted through the concourse in recent minutes and slowed almost imperceptibly, catching the energy of the exchange without fully understanding it. Darius did not respond immediately. He had learned in rooms far more dangerous than this one, with men far more genuinely threatening than this one, that the first word spoken after an accusation carried disproportionate weight, and that the choice of that word mattered more than almost anything else he could do in that moment. He chose it carefully. "My orders are in the front pocket of that bag," he said. His voice remained level, almost quiet, the particular quality of quiet that had nothing to do with submission. "My deployment papers, my travel voucher, my military email on my phone. I can show you all of it." "I'm going to need to search that bag." "That bag contains federal property," Darius said with the same unvarying calm. "You don't have jurisdiction over federal military equipment." Something flickered across Harlan's face. Not doubt, because Harlan had moved well past the range where doubt was available to him, but irritation. The particular irritation of a man who expected to be surrendered to and was being navigated around instead. He took a step closer. His posture shifted in the way men shifted when they felt their authority being managed rather than obeyed. "I have jurisdiction over this entire terminal," he said, "and right now I have reasonable suspicion that this ID is fraudulent and that uniform isn't yours, so I'm going to need you to stand up and come with me." "I'm not going to do that," Darius said, not aggressively, not defiantly, factually, the way a man stated a coordinate or a barometric reading. Information delivered without emotional loading, because emotional loading would only reduce the accuracy of what was being communicated. "I've presented valid military identification. I've offered to show you my orders and my travel documentation. I have not given you probable cause, and you do not have statutory authority over federal military personnel traveling on official orders." He paused for one beat. "I'm not going to stand up." "Yeah." Harlan simply stared at him, and in that moment, something shifted in the officer's expression. The last thin pretense of procedural legitimacy folded itself up quietly and stepped aside to make room for something raw and considerably less professional. His hand moved from his belt to his radio, then back. He looked around the terminal once, a quick, almost involuntary survey, and then his hand moved to his cuffs. "Last chance," Harlan said. Darius looked at the handcuffs. Then he looked back up at the officer, and his expression in that moment was not fear, not anger, not desperation. It was something closer to sorrow, the particular exhausted sorrow of a man who had given over a decade and portions of himself he would never fully recover to a country, and was now sitting in one of that country's airports being told, without a single explicit word of it being spoken aloud, exactly what that country thought of him when the uniform was not sufficient evidence. He stood up slowly. He put his hands out and said nothing because there was nothing left to say, and because somewhere in the disciplined, tactical part of his mind that never fully went offline, regardless of the environment or the hour or the level of humiliation currently in progress, he already understood that this moment was not where this ended. Harlan moved quickly, the way men moved when they wanted the physical act to outpace any further argument. He grabbed Darius's left wrist, spun him toward the bench with considerably more force than the situation required, and snapped the first cuff on with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found a particular satisfaction in the sound it made. The metal was cold against Darius's skin. The click was loud in the quiet terminal. Harlan threaded the chain through the steel armrest of the gate bench and locked the second cuff around Darius's right wrist, leaving him seated, arms pulled slightly forward, tethered to the furniture like something that needed to be contained. Darius sat with his spine straight and his chin level. He did not twist. He did not pull against the restraints. He did not say a word. He did not allow a single muscle in his face to betray the thing happening in his chest, which was not fear and was not rage, but was something that occupied the space between them and was, in certain respects, more difficult to manage than either. This was the discipline, the one that people outside the teams never fully understood, because they tended to focus on the physical elements, the training evolutions, the weapons proficiency, the capacity to operate for extended periods without sleep in terrain that had no sympathy for human limitation. Those things were real and they mattered, but they were not the deepest thing. The deepest thing was this: the ability to sit perfectly still inside a situation designed to humiliate you, to strip you of visible reaction, to reduce you in the eyes of anyone watching, and to not allow a single cell of your body to betray what was happening underneath. Darius had been trained to withstand interrogation. He had been trained to maintain cognitive function and behavioral discipline under conditions that would reduce most people to something unrecognizable. A pair of handcuffs applied in a Philadelphia airport by a man whose career had never once intersected with anything genuinely dangerous was not going to be the thing that broke his bearing. But that did not mean he did not feel it. He felt the cold metal against his wrists. He felt the eyes of the travelers who had stopped moving and were now standing at a cautious distance along the concourse, watching with the uncomfortable stillness of people who had recognized that something wrong was happening and had not yet decided what to do about it. He felt the particular weight of being a black man in a uniform that was supposed to mean something that had been earned at a cost that most people in this terminal would never be able to fully appreciate, sitting handcuffed to a bench while a white officer stood over him with his chest out and his radio in his hand, performing competence for an audience that had not asked for the show. He thought about Layla. He thought about how he would explain this to her someday. Not whether he would explain it, because he had already decided he would. She deserved to know the truth of the country she was growing up in, the full and complicated truth of it. But how? What words? What tone? Whether to be angry when he told her, or whether to be the thing he had chosen to be in this moment, composed, clear, and completely unbroken. He filed that thought away and returned to stillness. Harlan was on his radio now, his voice carrying the inflated authority of a man narrating his own heroism for an invisible audience. "Dispatch, this is Harlan at the gate. I've got a possible stolen valor situation. Subject detained, requesting a secondary unit for property search and processing." He glanced down at Darius as he said it, and there was something in that glance, a small, satisfied flicker, the particular look of a man who had gotten what he came for, that communicated more about Vance Harlan than anything else that had happened in the last several minutes. Several travelers had coalesced at the edge of the gate area. A middle-aged woman in scrubs, her coffee cup held forgotten at her side, eyes moving between the handcuffs and the officer with the focused attention of someone cataloging details. An older black man in a business suit, gripping the handle of his carry-on with white knuckles, his jaw set, watching Harlan with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and fury. And a gate agent in a blue airport vest, a young woman in her early 20s, who had stepped forward once, stopped, and then stepped forward again, her face uncertain. Phones were already up, not performing for social media, but documenting the way people documented things they understood to be significant before they fully understood why. Harlan, energized by the small audience and his own certainty, called in a second unit, and then allowed himself, in the private theater of his own mind, to begin composing the story. He would tell it in the break room. He would tell it to Holt over the phone later this morning. Possible stolen valor in the early hours. The guy had a good fake, but you cannot fool many years of experience. He had done this before. He had always walked away clean. The reason he had always walked away clean had a name: Deputy Chief Clayton Holt. Holt had been in his current position for some time and had developed over that time a reliable institutional instinct for which complaints were worth the administrative overhead of a formal review and which were not. On multiple occasions in recent years, complaints had been filed against Harlan by travelers who described encounters with troubling similarities to the one now unfolding at the gate. On multiple occasions, those complaints had crossed Holt's desk. On multiple occasions, they had emerged from that desk stamped with language that effectively closed them, insufficient evidence to support a pattern or officer conduct consistent with terminal security protocols, or, in one case, nothing at all. The complaint had simply been filed and nothing had followed. Harlan knew about the complaints in the abstract way that a man knew about things that had been handled on his behalf. He did not dwell on them. They were confirmation of what he already believed, that his judgment was sound and that the institution supported it. A second officer arrived at the gate, younger, with less time on the force, visibly uncertain in the way that junior officers were uncertain around Harlan, which was to say they read his certainty as authority and defaulted to it. The younger officer looked at Darius in the handcuffs, looked at Harlan, and said nothing. He stood where he was told to stand. Harlan moved toward the duffel bag. He crouched, reached for the front zipper, his hand almost closing around it. And then Darius's voice came, level and precise, citing the federal statute governing jurisdiction over military property in transit. The exact statute, the correct citation, the kind of thing a man knew because he had been briefed on his rights by a military lawyer before departing on every deployment for over a decade. Harlan's hand retreated from the bag. He covered the retreat with posture straightening, adjusting his belt, squaring his shoulders. But the retreat had happened, and the small crowd at the edge of the gate area had seen it, and one of the phones tracked the movement. He stood over the bench with his chest out and his radio in his hand. He was, by any external measure, completely in control of the situation. He was the officer. The man in the handcuffs was detained. The second unit was present. Backup was on the way. He was, in his own accounting of this moment, exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not hear the doors at a nearby gate open. Commander Elias Whitfield came through the gate doors mid-sentence. He was turned slightly toward the man on his left, Senior Chief Tyrone Graves, compact and iron-built from a small town outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A man with the deceptive stillness of someone perpetually calculating angles. And he was saying something about the transport schedule and the debrief timeline, a logistical conversation they had been having in pieces for the past stretch on the walk through the connection. He was a seasoned man with many years in naval special warfare, silver at his temples that had arrived early and settled permanently, the kind of gray that had everything to do with what a man had survived and nothing to do with vanity. He wore his uniform with the quiet authority of a man who had never once in his life needed it to speak for him, because he had always been more than capable of speaking for himself. He was not a tall man, medium build, but he occupied space in a way that had nothing to do with physical dimensions and everything to do with the particular quality of command presence that could not be trained into a person, only developed through the specific crucible of repeated high-stakes consequence. His eyes moved down the concourse in the automatic, habitual threat assessment sweep that had not fully switched off in many years, that ran continuously the way breathing ran continuously below conscious instruction, responsive to input that bypassed the ordinary civilian filtering process that told most people what in their environment was worth attending to, and what was not. He stopped walking, not dramatically, not with any visible alarm. He simply stopped the way a targeting system stops when it acquires, completely without residual momentum, without the half-step of hesitation that stopped most people, because most people's bodies had to catch up to their minds. Whitfield's body and his mind stopped at the same instant, and his eyes locked onto the bench at the gate, with the absolute unblinking focus of a man who had just processed something that required his complete and undivided attention. Graves stopped a half-step later, following Whitfield's sightline, and went very still. Darius Delaney, utility uniform, green duffel on the floor beside the bench, wrists cuffed to the steel armrest, an airport officer standing over him with a radio in one hand, and his chest inflated with the particular posture of a man who believed he had just made the arrest of his career. Neither man said anything for a moment. Then Graves said very quietly and with perfect calm, "That man has no idea." Whitfield was already moving. His stride did not accelerate into urgency. Urgency was for people who had not yet learned the difference between speed and efficiency, and Whitfield had learned that difference in places that punished the confusion. His stride simply became purposeful in the particular way that cleared space without demanding it, that parted ambient crowds not through aggression, but through the sheer undeniable communication of intent. People moved without knowing why they had moved until after they had already done it. Graves fell in beside him. Behind them, the other operators who had come through the gate in the first group adjusted their course without a word being exchanged. Petty Officer Jamal Cross, a breacher from Memphis whose hands looked like they had been designed by someone with a very specific purpose in mind. Petty Officer Rafael Reyes, the team's senior sniper, who moved with the particular conserved energy of someone who spent most of his professional life waiting for exactly the right moment. And Chief Petty Officer Gavin Ditt, the team's senior medic, who noticed everything in any given environment within moments of entering it, and forgot nothing he had noticed. They adjusted without instruction, because they had been operating together long enough that the communication happened below language. Whitfield's course change was a sentence. They had read it. Darius heard them before he saw them. He recognized the cadence, not the number of footsteps, not the specific individuals, but the quality of the approach, the particular unhurried collective weight of men moving with shared purpose toward a fixed point. He had heard that particular sound in enough environments, under enough conditions, at enough levels of ambient chaos, that it had become something his nervous system processed independently of his conscious mind. His eyes tracked left, down the concourse. When he saw Whitfield's face across the distance, something in his chest that had been locked in careful, disciplined containment released exactly 1 degree. Not relief, not yet, not completely, but recognition, the specific bone-deep recognition of a man who has just seen his people. He did not call out. He did not gesture. He simply held Whitfield's gaze across the distance, and in that look passed everything that needed to be passed: the situation, the status, the instruction to stay measured, communicated in the way that men communicated when words were either unavailable or inadvisable. Whitfield received it. He gave the smallest possible nod. Harlan had his back partially turned, still on his radio, still narrating his own importance to dispatch. When the gate agent in the blue vest, who had been watching the approaching group with progressively widening eyes, took an involuntary step backward, the older black man in the business suit, who had been standing rigid with barely contained outrage, exhaled audibly, something loosening in his posture, as if he had been waiting for exactly this without knowing it until now. Harlan registered the shift in the ambient energy of the terminal, the way all bullies eventually registered it, too late and with the wrong instincts. He turned. He saw Whitfield first, then Graves, then the operators behind them. His radio hand lowered, an involuntary response, the body processing information that the mind had not yet finished forming its denial around. He turned slightly to face the approaching group, recalibrating his posture, reaching for the procedural scaffolding that had reliably supported him through many years of situations he had manufactured and controlled. Whitfield stopped a short distance from the bench. He looked at Darius. He looked at the handcuffs. He looked at the duffel bag undisturbed on the floor where Darius had set it. He took in the careful, controlled composure of a man who had been sitting in restraints and had not once lost his bearing. And then he looked at Officer Vance Harlan, and his expression in that moment was not anger. Anger would have been easier to dismiss, easier to frame as emotional instability, easier to write up as a civilian overreaction to routine security procedure. It was assessment, cold, total, and completely without mercy. "Who are you?" Whitfield said, and it was not phrased as a question. "And what do you think you're doing to my operator?" Harlan opened his mouth. What came out was not the authoritative response he had intended. It had the shape of authority, the vocabulary, the structural confidence without the substance, the way a frame could maintain its dimensions after the canvas had been removed. "Sir, this is a security matter. I'm going to need you to step back and let me—" "I asked you a question," Whitfield said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The words landed with the particular gravitational weight of a man who had spent many years giving orders in environments where the wrong decision produced body bags, and whose vocal cords had long since absorbed that reality into their default register. The gate agent took another step back. One of the phone cameras swung toward Whitfield. Harlan recalibrated. He reached for procedure. "I have a subject detained on suspicion of stolen valor. The ID he presented is potentially fraudulent, and I have reasonable—" "That man," Whitfield said with a precision that cut cleanly through the middle of Harlan's sentence, "is Chief Petty Officer Darius Delaney. He is an active-duty United States Navy SEAL with over a decade of service, multiple combat deployments, and a Silver Star with valor. He is traveling on official military orders." He paused for one beat, the duration precisely calibrated. "And he is my operator." The last three words were not loud. They were simply final. Not because they ended a conversation, but because they rearranged the entire architecture of the room. The gate doors opened again. More operators came through in a loose column that tightened naturally as they entered the concourse, the way water found its shape in whatever vessel it entered. Then more behind them. After that, the last group still rolling their shoulders loose from the transport, still carrying the particular physical density of men who had spent recent time doing things that the airport's ambient lighting had no framework to comprehend. They were different sizes, different ages, different faces. They moved with the same unhurried collective gravity. And when the lead group saw Whitfield stopped at the bench, saw Graves's posture, saw the handcuffs on Darius Delaney's wrists, the column did not accelerate, did not react with visible alarm, did not break into anything resembling disorder. It simply oriented like a single organism that had just identified the location of a problem and was now adjusting its geometry accordingly. Graves moved first, stepping to Darius's left and positioning himself between the bench and the open concourse with the natural, wordless efficiency of a man who had spent years placing his body between threats and the people he was responsible for. Cross moved to the right, his broad frame settling into a stillness that was somehow more physically imposing than movement would have been. Reyes and Ditt closed the rear angle, and then the rest of the platoon arrived and filled the remaining space with a quiet, physical authority that transformed the gate area from a public airport terminal into something else entirely, something with different rules, a different weight, a different understanding of who held the ground. They did not form a line. They formed a perimeter. No hands on weapons, no raised voices, no theatrical displays of force, no aggressive posturing, no visible anger, just presence. Sheer, overwhelming, geometrically precise presence. The operators in utility uniforms standing in a configuration that left Officer Vance Harlan exactly one place to be, the center of a circle he had not consented to enter, and could not exit without walking through men who had been trained to hold ground in conditions that would have ended him. Harlan turned once, slowly, and read the faces around him. Some were watching him with open, measured contempt, the specific contempt of professionals who had processed what they were looking at and had made their assessment and were not attempting to conceal it. Some watched him with the blank, controlled neutrality of men who had learned to keep their expressions clean in operational environments, because emotion was information, and information was a resource you did not distribute carelessly. And on two or three faces, Ditt notably, and a younger operator near the back whose name Harlan would never know, there was the particular quiet fury of men who had arrived too late to prevent something, and were now doing the precise, cold arithmetic of what came next. None of them said a word. The silence was enormous in a way that silence in a public space almost never was. It pressed. It had weight. It communicated things that would have required paragraphs to say less effectively. The crowd of onlookers had grown considerably. Not a mob, not a confrontation, but a dense, hushed accumulation of people who had sensed that something significant was happening and found themselves unable to simply walk past it. The gate agent in the blue vest had been joined by a second airport employee, both standing well back, both with phones out. Now not for social media, but with the instinctive impulse of people documenting something they understood to be important before they fully understood why. The older black man in the business suit had not moved from his position. He was breathing slowly and watching Harlan with an expression that had moved past anger into something more permanent and more diagnostic. A pilot in uniform had stopped a short distance away and was watching Whitfield with the grim recognition of a man who had seen enough of the world to know what he was looking at. Harlan's radio crackled. He did not answer it. The silence of that non-answer communicated more about the state of his cognition than anything he could have said. He was no longer operating procedurally. He was operating on adrenaline and instinct and many years of accumulated certainty, and all three were failing him simultaneously. Whitfield produced his military AD from his breast pocket with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never once in his life needed a prop to establish who he was, but understood that what was about to happen needed to be documented correctly from the first word. He held it where Harlan could read it clearly. He did not hand it over. Lieutenant Commander Elias Whitfield, United States Navy Special Warfare Command. He let that sit. You are currently holding one of my operators in unauthorized restraints while he travels on federal military orders. This is a violation of Title 10 of the United States Code, which governs the jurisdiction of civilian law enforcement over active-duty military personnel traveling under official orders. His voice was even, methodical, the cadence of a man reading coordinates rather than making an argument. You do not have probable cause. You do not have federal authority, and whatever you told your dispatch, you do not have a stolen valor case. What you have is a civil rights violation in progress, and it is being recorded from multiple angles. Harlan's mouth opened. What you had, Whitfield said, and the evenness of his voice in that moment made what followed hit considerably harder than any raised tone could have managed, was a black man in a uniform sitting quietly at a gate. That is what you had, and I want you to be very precise with yourself right now in this moment about whether what you did next was driven by reasonable suspicion or by something else entirely. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. It had the quality of a room that had just heard the exact truth spoken without decoration and was processing the experience of recognizing truth when it arrived. Graves had produced a small laminated card from his breast pocket and was reading from it in a low, carrying voice, not performing, not theatrically, just documenting aloud in the way that operators documented everything that might eventually matter. Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, Class E felony on first offense, escalating with injury or pattern of conduct. He looked up at Harlan with an expression of pleasant professional neutrality. Just so we're all working from the same source material. Harlan looked at Graves. He looked at the card. He looked at Whitfield. The color in his face had shifted from the aggressive flush of manufactured authority into something paler and less certain, the circulatory response to genuine fear rather than the performed heat of a man accustomed to dominating his environment by choosing his targets carefully. I was following procedure, Harlan said. The words came out smaller than he had intended. They had the shape of a defense, without the conviction that made a defense worth presenting. Your procedure, Whitfield said, does not supersede federal law. Your jurisdiction in this terminal is concurrent with federal jurisdiction. It is not superior to it. You cannot detain, search, or compel a federal military employee traveling under official orders without probable cause that meets federal standards. A uniform and a military ID that you personally decided looked suspicious does not meet that standard. He tilted his head slightly. Your department's legal counsel is going to tell you the exact same thing, probably within the hour. See ya. Whitfield produced his phone. He dialed without breaking eye contact. The call connected. This is Commander Elias Whitfield, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need a federal marshal and military police at the gate in Terminal B. I have an active duty SEAL operator in unauthorized civilian detention on official travel orders. Yes. Now. Thank you. He ended the call. He returned the phone to his pocket. Marshals will be here shortly, Whitfield said. I would strongly suggest you use that time to remove those handcuffs and think very carefully about whether you have anything to say that begins with an apology. Harlan stood there for several more seconds, seconds of a man running an internal calculation that had no favorable outcome available in any direction, looking at a circle of operators who had collectively survived things he had no reference point to imagine, understanding for the first time with the full and devastating clarity of a man who has just run out of road what he had done and what it was going to cost him. Then, with hands that were no longer entirely steady, he reached for his keys. The handcuffs came off with the same metallic click they had gone on with. The sound was identical. The meaning was the inverse of everything it had been moments ago. Dit was there before Harlan had fully stepped back, crouching in front of Darius with a small flashlight in steady professional hands, examining both wrists with the focused efficiency of a man who had performed medical assessments in conditions that made a fluorescent terminal look like a surgical suite. He photographed each wrist from multiple angles. He noted the time aloud twice. He documented the faint red impressions the restraints had left against Darius's skin, in a voice so calm and precise that it already sounded like testimony, because it was. Darius rolled his wrists once slowly and said nothing. He reached down and placed one hand on his duffel bag, not lifting it, not making a production of it, just touching it. The quiet reestablishment of a man reclaiming what was his. Harlan had retreated several steps. He stood in the loose center of the perimeter with the particular stillness of a man who had run out of moves and was now simply waiting for whatever came next. His radio had gone silent. Either dispatch had stopped calling or he had finally, belatedly, turned the volume off. His hand was nowhere near his holster. The aggressive physical architecture of his posture from earlier, the puffed chest, the proprietary stance, the physical language of a man who believed the ground belonged to him, had collapsed inward, leaving something smaller and considerably less certain in its place. He did not have to wait long. They heard them before they saw them. Not footsteps this time, but the specific frequency of institutional urgency, the sound of people moving through a public space with credentials and clear purpose, and the particular energy of people who had done this before and knew exactly what they were walking into. The crowd along the concourse edge parted without being asked, and several figures came through the gap with the kind of coordinated, no-nonsense momentum that immediately reordered the hierarchy of every room they entered. 2 federal marshals in plain clothes, badges visible on their belts, moved with the compact efficiency of people who had responded to enough calls to have stopped performing urgency and had learned simply to embody it. Behind them came 2 men in the administrative uniforms of the Philadelphia Airport Authority, not the floor-level officers who managed gate disputes and noise complaints, but the senior tier, the men whose names appeared on the liability paperwork, whose offices had windows facing the tarmac, whose phones had been ringing with calls they had not enjoyed receiving. The lead marshal was a woman in her late 40s named Agent Patricia Dunn. She was lean, precise in her movements, with the focused economy of a person who had been doing this long enough that nothing in an airport surprised her anymore. She took in the scene in moments, the platoon perimeter, the bench, Darius seated with Dit beside him, Whitfield standing in front of Harlan, Harlan himself, the crowd, the cameras, the energy of the room, and her expression settled into the particular focused neutrality of someone who had already begun building the case file in her head before she had cleared the crowd. She looked at Whitfield. He looked at her. She brought her hand up in a crisp, clean salute. Her partner, a half step behind her, mirrored the gesture without hesitation, and then, after a beat that contained a small but significant hesitation, the hesitation of men recalibrating their understanding of exactly what they had walked into and who in this room actually held the authority, both airport directors straightened and followed suit. Whitfield returned the salute with the economy of a man for whom the gesture was as automatic as breathing. Around him, several of the senior operators came to attention, without being asked. the collective automatic response of men who had been doing it long enough that it lived in the muscle rather than the mind. Harlan watched all of it. He watched the marshal salute the operator. He watched the airport directors follow. He watched the faces of the platoon, unchanged, watching him. He watched the crowd, which had grown, all of them still, all of them documenting, and something in his face, some final remnant of the certainty that had brought him to this bench in the early morning hours, went away and did not come back. Dunn crossed the perimeter without acknowledging Harlan, and stopped in front of Darius. "Chief Petty Officer Delaney," she said. "I'm Federal Marshal Patricia Dunn. Are you injured?" "No, ma'am," Darius said. "Do you require medical attention?" "No, ma'am." She nodded once, the precise acknowledgement of a professional registering information, and then turned and looked at Harlan for the first time since entering the gate area. She looked at him the way professionals looked at problems, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, but with the clean administrative clarity of someone identifying what needed to be processed and in what order. "Officer Harlan," she said, "badge and weapon, please. Osa." Seat. Gerald Marsh, Senior Airport Authority Director with many years in the role of a man who had navigated every category of airport crisis except this one, stepped forward before Harlan could respond. His voice was tight and controlled in the specific register of managing an institutional catastrophe in real time, consciously moderating his tone because he was aware that everything said in the next moments was being recorded from multiple angles. "Officer Harlan, you are hereby suspended pending federal review. Please comply immediately." Harlan looked at Marsh, then at Dunn, then one final time at the circle of men around him, at their stillness, at their complete and total absence of anything resembling uncertainty. He looked at Whitfield last, and Whitfield looked back at him with the same expression he had worn since he stopped at the bench, cold, total, and completely devoid of the anger that would have made it easier to dismiss. Something in Vance Harlan seemed to arrive finally, and without any remaining resistance at the full understanding of where he was, not just in this terminal, in this gate area, in this circle, but where in the larger architecture of consequence many years of choices had delivered him. He unclipped his badge with one hand, his weapon with the other. He held them out. His hands were steady now, which was somehow worse than if they had been shaking. The steadiness of a man who had moved past the range where trembling was available to him into the territory where the body simply executed what the mind had accepted. Dunn took the weapon. She handed it to her partner without looking away from Harlan. She handed the badge to Marsh, who received it with the expression of a man holding something that had just cost him enormously, not personally exactly, but institutionally, which in his position amounted to the same thing. The second marshal moved behind Harlan. The handcuffs produced the same sound they always produced, the small mechanical click of a ratchet engaging, cold metal closing, the particular finality of restraint applied. Harlan absorbed the sound without visible reaction. He was past reaction. From the bench, Darius watched it happen. His duffel bag was at his feet. His wrists were free. His bearing was exactly what it had been from the first moment Harlan had approached him. Straight, quiet, and completely intact. Not a performance of composure, not a suppression of feeling. The genuine, earned stillness of a man who had decided what mattered and had held to it without deviation. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply watched because some things deserved to be witnessed. The federal courtroom in Philadelphia had the particular gravity of a room where the government was not performing justice but administering it. No gallery cameras, no crowd of spectators arrived for drama, just the clean, institutional weight of proceedings that moved with the unhurried certainty of a machine that had already assessed the quality of the evidence and was now working through the formal structure of presenting it. The case was United States versus Harlan. It moved from incident to verdict in weeks, which was fast by federal standards, and said something specific about what the prosecution was working with. The airport security footage was entered into evidence early in the trial. All of it, multiple camera angles across Terminal B, time-stamped and unedited. covering every moment from the second Harlan's eyes landed on Darius Delaney at the gate to the moment the handcuffs were removed from his wrists. The prosecution played it in sequence without narration, without editorial commentary, without anything except the footage itself and the quiet hum of the courtroom's ventilation system. It was sufficient. The footage showed Harlan leaving his vehicle and moving toward the gate before any interaction had occurred, before any behavior had been observed, before any conceivable procedural justification had presented itself. It showed him approaching with a specific quality of deliberateness, the walk of a man who had already made a decision and was now executing it. It showed him standing over Darius with his hand near his holster during a conversation in which Darius had done nothing except sit still and speak in complete, measured sentences. And then the footage showed the moment that the prosecution would return to several times during the trial, the moment Harlan examined the military ID, turned it in the fluorescent light, studied it, and then looked up at Darius's face and made his decision. Not before the ID, after it. The defense argued reasonable suspicion throughout the trial. The footage made that argument very difficult to sustain, because reasonable suspicion, by definition, required that the suspicion precede the decision. The footage established clearly which came first. Whitfield testified. He took the stand in his dress uniform, his decorations in their precise rows, his posture identical whether he was standing in a combat briefing room or a federal courtroom, completely without performance, completely without effect, and therefore completely devastating to anything that tried to stand against it. He answered every question with the same measured precision he brought to operational debriefs, providing dates, time-specific regulatory citations, and a chronological account of events so detailed and internally consistent that the defense attorney's cross-examination ran its course before quietly running out of productive ground to cover. Graves testified after him, then Cross, then Ditt, who submitted his photographic documentation of Darius's wrists as an exhibit, and walked the jury through each image with the clinical specificity of a man trained to observe and record things that other people missed. The contusion patterns consistent with restraint applied with excessive force, the pressure marks whose geometry matched the specific dimensions of the cuffs Harlan had used, the timestamps placing the photographs within minutes of the restraints being removed. The jury looked at those photographs for a long time. Darius testified last. He wore his dress uniform. He sat in the witness chair with his hands folded on the railing. His posture exactly what it had been at the gate, in the terminal, in the minutes of restraint, in every moment of this entire proceeding from beginning to the present one. Straight, quiet, completely intact. He answered every question in the same level, unhurried voice he had used in the terminal, the voice that had nothing to prove and nothing to conceal, and was therefore the most credible sound in the room. He described the approach, the timing, the distance, the rocking on the heels, the deliberate silence before the first question. He described the questions one by one, and his answers to each, and the escalation from performative procedure into something that had stopped being about procedure. He described the moment the handcuffs went on, the force used, the cold metal, the click. He described what he had felt. He did it without embellishment, without visible anger, without the kind of emotional performance that defense attorneys characterized as bias or instability. He described it the way he would describe a mission debrief, factually, sequentially, with the particular authority of a man who had been present for every moment of what he was recounting, and had retained every detail with the precise fidelity of someone trained to notice and remember. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, he attempted a reframing. Darius had been uncooperative. Darius had refused to comply with a lawful request. Darius had, through his refusal, escalated a routine security interaction into a confrontation that could have been avoided. The implication was that whatever followed was at some level the result of Darius's choices rather than Harlan's. Darius listened to the question with the same patient, unvarying attention he brought to everything. Then he said, "I cited the federal statute governing civilian law enforcement authority over military personnel traveling on official orders. That statute is not a refusal. It is the law. An officer who responds to a citizen knowing the law by escalating to physical restraint is not responding to provocation. He is responding to information he found inconvenient. He paused for one beat. I did not escalate the situation. I accurately described it. The defense attorney did not follow up on that line. When the prosecution asked how he had remained so composed during the detention, Darius was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was quiet with him. Then he said, "Because I knew that how I behaved in that moment was going to matter more than what was being done to me. And because I've been in situations where losing your composure gets people killed. This wasn't one of those situations, but the discipline doesn't turn off." The jury did not look away from him once. At the defense table, Vance Harlan stared at his hands throughout Darius's testimony. He did not look up. He did not look at Darius. Not once. From the moment Darius took the witness stand to the moment he stepped down, he stared at the table in front of him, with the focused, inward blankness of a man who had decided that the most he could manage in this room at this point was to simply endure it. The jury was out for hours and returned guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, civil rights violation under color of authority, conduct unbecoming a law enforcement officer. The verdict arrived with the clean, unambiguous finality of a decision that had not required significant deliberation, which was itself a statement about the quality of the evidence and the clarity of what had been done. The sentencing hearing had a different atmosphere than the trial. It lacked the sharp procedural urgency of the evidence phase, the almost electric tension of the footage playing in the dim courtroom, the surgical precision of the testimony. Instead, the room had settled into something heavier and more permanent. The cold, inescapable gravity of a moment that was not about establishing facts, but about assigning their weight. Judge Evelyn Hayes had been appointed to the federal bench specifically for cases of this nature: public corruption, civil rights abuse, the particular category of harm that occurred when the power of official authority was turned against the people it existed to protect. She viewed a corrupt badge not merely as a crime, but as a fundamental betrayal of the compact between government and citizen, and her sentencing record in such cases reflected that view without ambiguity. She sat high behind the polished mahogany bench, her eyes moving over the defense table with the steady, measuring attention of a woman who had seen many men stand in Harlan's position and had never once found the experience routine. Harlan was ordered to stand. He no longer looked like the man who had swaggered out of his cruiser in the early morning hours in Terminal B, with his chest out and his certainty intact. He had lost weight. His posture had collapsed into something uncertain and effortful, as if maintaining vertical alignment required continuous conscious attention. His jaw worked silently. His hands at his sides were still. Judge Hayes addressed him directly, and her voice carried through the high-ceilinged room with the particular clarity of someone who intended to be heard and understood completely. "You were given a badge," she said. "You were given it as an instrument of protection, a tool meant to shield and serve the people of this city without qualification and without exception. You chose instead to use it as a tool of selective domination. You looked at a man who had given over a decade to the defense of this country, who was sitting quietly in an airport terminal, who presented his credentials, who cited the law accurately and without aggression, who offered you every available avenue to perform your job honestly, and you chose not to take any of them. You looked at him and made a different choice. And I want you to be clear, standing in this courtroom, that the record of this proceeding will reflect exactly what that choice was and what it was based on." Harlan's eyes were fixed on a point somewhere below the judge's bench. A single tear tracked down his left cheek. He did not wipe it. The sentence was months in federal custody, to be followed by years of supervised release, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, mandatory enrollment in a federal civil rights restitution program, a federal civil judgment attached to his professional record through every background check for the remainder of his working life. He would never carry a badge again. And then Judge Hayes addressed one additional matter: Deputy Chief Clayton Holt, whose name had surfaced during federal discovery as the official who had closed multiple prior complaints against Harlan without adequate investigation, complaints that, had they been properly processed, might have altered the events of that morning in the terminal, had been simultaneously indicted on federal obstruction charges. The indictment had been filed. His attorney had been notified. His position within the Philadelphia Airport Authority had been suspended pending the proceedings. The trap had not closed around one man. It had closed around the architecture that had protected him. The freight logistics depot outside Chester, Pennsylvania, operated around the clock, which suited Vance Harlan in the specific way that structure suited men who were in the process of learning to live without the structure they had previously defined themselves by. He worked the night shift. He arrived in the evening and left in the morning, and in between he moved pallets and scanned packages and operated a forklift that he had needed weeks to learn, and was now adequate at and interacted with a team of men half his age who knew his name from the badge clipped to his vest, and not from any prior reputation, and did not want to know anything more than that. The work asked nothing of him except his body and his time. It had clear beginnings and clear endings, and no moral complexity whatsoever. No discretion required, no judgment called upon, no authority to exercise or abuse. He was learning, with considerable difficulty and in the particular privacy of a man who had nowhere left to hide from himself, to find a stripped-down dignity in that. The days outside the depot were harder. His wife Claire had stayed. This surprised him more than almost anything else that had happened in the past period, and he thought about it more than he was comfortable admitting. She was a harder woman than he had understood during the years when he had been too certain of himself to see her with any real clarity. She had sat across from him at the kitchen table the week after the sentencing. Not the conviction, the sentencing, because she had processed the conviction privately and alone and had not asked him any questions about it, and told him without raising her voice and without crying that she was staying, but that things were going to be different. And that different meant he was going to spend a significant portion of the rest of his life figuring out who he actually was without a badge and a uniform and many years of unchallenged authority to tell him. He had nodded. He had not argued. He was learning, slowly and at considerable cost, that she was right. His son Wyatt was a teenager, tall, quiet, earnest in the way of young men who had grown up watching their fathers carefully, and had decided somewhere along the way, consciously or not, with love or with the complicated thing that lived alongside love in families like theirs, to try to be something better. Wyatt had wanted to join the Navy since he was young, not because of his father, or perhaps partly because of his father, or perhaps precisely in spite of him, the way children's deepest ambitions were always tangled up in complicated, unresolvable ways with the people who had raised them. He had applied to the Navy ROTC program. He had passed every physical requirement. He had scored in the top percentile on his ASVAB. He had written a personal statement that his high school counselor described as the best she had read in many years of sending students to military programs. And then the background check had reached his father's federal record. The waiver process had begun, and the waiver process had stalled, and the waiver process had eventually produced a letter that said, in the careful bureaucratic language of institutional rejection, that his application could not be approved at this time due to considerations arising from his household background check. Wyatt had not cried in front of his father. He had gone to his room and closed the door, and the sound of that door closing had been the worst sound Vance Harlan had heard since the judge's gavel, and the silence on the other side of it had been worse than the sound. Harlan had stood in the hallway for a long time, his hand not quite touching the door, understanding in the most concrete and irrevocable terms he had yet encountered that his failures had reached forward in time, like a long shadow, and had taken something from his child, something Wyatt had earned honestly, something that had nothing to do with his father's choices, something that should have been his. Harlan had stood in that hallway and felt the full weight of that, and he had not known what to do with it. Later, he still did not. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. It was a standard white envelope, business-sized, addressed to Wyatt Harlan in neat, precise handwriting. The return address in the upper left corner was a Virginia Beach zip code. Vance Harlan picked it up from the mail pile on the kitchen counter, read the zip code, felt something tighten in his chest, and set it down without opening it, because it was not his to open. He made coffee. He waited. Wyatt came downstairs, still in the gray sweatshirt he slept in, his hair uncombed, moving with the automatic morning economy of a teenager who had not yet fully committed to being awake. He sorted through the mail with the practiced disinterest of someone performing a routine: bills for his parents, a catalog for no one in particular, the standard debris of a household. And then he stopped. He picked up the white envelope. He looked at the return address. His face went through something, a small, quick sequence of expressions that Harlan, watching from across the kitchen with his coffee mug held in both hands, could not fully read. Then Wyatt sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Harlan watched his son read. He watched the confusion, the slight furrow of the brow, the slight tilt of the head, the expression of a person encountering something that did not immediately fit into any available category. He watched the careful rereading, Wyatt's eyes tracking back to the top of the page and moving through it again, more slowly, more deliberately, as if verifying that the words said what he thought they said. He watched the slow, disbelieving stillness that followed, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has just encountered something they do not yet have a framework to process, something that requires a moment of complete internal reorganization before the response can begin to form. Then Wyatt looked up. His eyes were bright in a way that Vance Harlan had not seen in months, not since before the letter from the ROTC program, not since before the conviction, not since before all of it. Bright with something that was not quite hope yet, because hope required believing that the thing was real, and Wyatt was still in the process of deciding whether it was real. "Dad," he said. His voice was careful, controlled, doing the specific work of someone managing an emotion they were not ready to show. "You need to read this." Harlan sat down his mug. He crossed the kitchen. He took the letter that Wyatt held out to him with both hands. It was a character endorsement letter, formal, precisely structured, written in the authoritative, methodical language of someone who understood how institutional documents moved through bureaucratic channels, not by demanding attention, but by making themselves impossible to ignore. The letterhead was professional. The language was specific and measured. It addressed the ROTC waiver board directly. It outlined Wyatt's application in detail, his scores, his physical assessments, his personal statement, the qualities it evidenced. It spoke to the nature of the son as distinct and independent from the nature of the father, with the particular moral clarity of someone who had given the distinction serious thought and had reached a conclusion they were prepared to defend. It made the case methodically, and without sentimentality, and without a single wasted word that the sins of a father should not determine the ceiling of a son, that the United States military, which asked its members to be judged by their conduct and their character and their commitment, ought to extend the same standard to the families of those who sought to serve. The letter was signed by Chief Petty Officer Darius Delaney, United States Navy, Special Warfare Command, Virginia Beach, Virginia. Harlan read it once. He stood at the kitchen counter and read every word and felt each one land in a different part of him. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on the table very carefully, the particular carefulness of a man placing something fragile, something that might break if handled without attention. And he stood there in his kitchen in the early morning light, with his coffee going cold on the counter behind him. What was happening in his chest did not have a clean name. He had spent time inside the aftermath of his own choices, and he had become familiar with the texture of shame, the specific heavy weight of regret, the grinding, low-grade awareness of what he had caused other people. He knew those feelings. This was not those feelings, or not only those feelings. This was something older and more fundamental, something that required him to hold simultaneously the worst of what he had done and the grace that was being extended to him across the distance of it. Not because he had earned the grace, not because he deserved it, not because any accounting of his actions over many years would have produced it as a fair outcome, but precisely and only because the man extending it had chosen to, and because that choice reflected something about Darius Delaney's character that no courtroom proceeding and no federal conviction could diminish or qualify. He had been seen clearly, completely, including the worst of himself, and he was being extended grace anyway. Claire appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, still in her morning robe, her hair not yet done. She looked at Wyatt. She looked at Harlan. She read the room in the way she had been reading rooms for many years of marriage, quietly, accurately, and without requiring an explanation. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his arm, and he let her, which was itself something he was still learning how to do. Wyatt was already on the phone, his voice low and careful and working very hard not to sound as undone as he was, talking to someone at the ROTC waiver board, asking questions in the measured tone of someone who had been disappointed before and was protecting himself against the possibility of another disappointment by not allowing himself to feel the hope until it was confirmed. Harlan picked up the letter one more time. He read the name at the bottom, Darius Delaney, the precise block letters, the service designation beneath, and held it in his hands in the pale morning light of his kitchen. Vance Harlan, who had not cried since the day the judge read his sentence, sat down at his kitchen table and wept. Not for himself. He was past the point where tears on his own behalf seemed proportionate to what he had done. He wept for the standard he had failed to meet, for the decade of service he had tried to erase with minutes of arrogance, for the shadow he had cast over his son through choices Wyatt had nothing to do with and no power to undo. And he wept with the most complicated gratitude he had ever experienced in his life. For the man who had every reason in the world to let that shadow stand, and who had chosen, with no obligation and no audience and no expectation of acknowledgement, to lift it instead. Darius Delaney had spent over a decade learning that real strength was not about what you could destroy. That morning in a kitchen in Chester, Pennsylvania, a man who had tried to unmake him learned the same lesson from the other side, the harder side, the side that required you to accept that the grace you had been given was larger than anything you had done to deserve it, and to carry that truth without flinching for the rest of your life. Wyatt's voice rose slightly in the next room. Just slightly, but enough. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one.